December 1944. The Ardennes forest stood silent, under a blanket of fresh snow, its pristine white surface broken only by the dark shadows of pine trees stretching toward a grey winter sky. Corporal James Mitchell crouched behind a frozen embankment, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as he watched 3 German artillery positions through his binoculars. These weren't ordinary cannons. They were the reason his battalion had lost 43 men in the past 2 days. Every time American forces attempted to advance through the valley below, those 3 guns opened fire with devastating precision, turning supply trucks into burning wreckage and infantry positions into chaos. Command had tried everything. Airstrikes were impossible in this weather. Infantry assaults had failed twice, with heavy casualties. Now, with ammunition running low and reinforcements days away, Mitchell found himself staring at those 3 guns and doing something most soldiers would consider insane. He was planning to fire his mortar backwards. If you're enjoying this story of an incredible moment in military history, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of courage and ingenuity from World War II. Mitchell was 24 years old, a farm boy from Iowa who had joined the army 2 years earlier with dreams of adventure and patriotism. Reality had proven far different from those dreams. The European theatre was cold, brutal, and unforgiving. He had seen friends die in his arms, watched entire squads disappear in artillery barrages, and learned that survival often depended more on luck than skill. But Mitchell had one advantage that set him apart from other soldiers. Before the war, he had studied engineering at Iowa State University for 3 semesters before his family's farm fell on hard times. He understood trajectories, angles, and physics in ways most combat soldiers never learned. That knowledge was about to save countless lives. The situation was desperate. Mitchell's company, part of the 28th Infantry Division, held a defensive position on the western edge of a valley near the Belgian town of Wiltz. The Germans controlled the high ground to the east, where they had positioned 3 150 mm howitzers in reinforced positions. These guns commanded the entire valley, making any American movement suicidal. Intelligence reports indicated the Germans had maybe 200 rounds remaining for those cannons, but that was more than enough to destroy Mitchell's entire battalion if they attempted to retreat or advance. The weather showed no signs of clearing, which meant no air support. The company commander, Captain Robert Hensley, had gathered his senior non-commissioned officers in a makeshift command post, a partially collapsed farmhouse basement that smelled of damp earth and diesel fuel. Captain Hensley was a career officer from Virginia, 32 years old, with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much death. He spread a hand-drawn map across an ammunition crate serving as a table, his finger tracing the German positions. The captain's voice was hoarse from shouting orders over artillery fire for the past week. He explained that division headquarters needed this valley cleared within 48 hours. A major offensive was planned to the north, and they couldn't risk leaving these German guns operational in their rear. But how could they silence 3 well-protected artillery pieces with the limited resources available? The officers in that basement knew they were discussing a near-impossible task. Sergeant Tom Walsh, a stocky Irishman from Boston who served as the company's senior mortar specialist, argued for a night assault. He proposed sending a small team to infiltrate the German lines after dark, plant explosives, and destroy the guns manually. It was bold and dangerous, but Walsh had successfully completed similar missions in France during the summer. Captain Hensley listened, but shook his head. The ground was frozen solid, covered in snow that would show every footprint. The Germans had been on high alert since yesterday's failed attack. They would see any infiltration team coming and cut them down with machine gun fire before they got within 50 yards of those cannons. Lieutenant Frank Pearson, a young officer from California who had only been with the company for 3 weeks, suggested a diversionary attack. They could feint an assault from the south while a small mortar team moved into position from the north. It was textbook tactics, exactly what they taught at Officer Candidate School, but Captain Hensley knew the Germans expected exactly that kind of maneuver. They had positioned machine gun nests covering every approach to their artillery. Any diversion would simply result in more American casualties without achieving the objective. The captain's frustration was evident in his clenched jaw and the way he kept rubbing his temples, trying to think of an answer that wasn't coming. Mitchell had been standing quietly in the corner of the basement, listening to the discussion. He was only a corporal, the lowest-ranking man in the room, and military protocol discouraged junior enlisted men from speaking at officer briefings. But as he listened to the debate going nowhere, something clicked in his mind. He remembered a physics problem from his university days, something about ballistic trajectories and unconventional firing solutions. The idea seemed crazy at first, but the more he thought about it, the more sense it made. He cleared his throat nervously, and all eyes in the room turned toward him. Captain Hensley's expression was stern, clearly annoyed at the interruption from a corporal, but he nodded for Mitchell to speak. Mitchell's hands trembled slightly as he approached the map. He wasn't accustomed to addressing officers, especially not to propose something that sounded completely insane. But he began to explain his idea. The German artillery positions were on high ground, elevated approximately 200 feet above the valley floor. American forces were positioned on lower ground to the west. Every previous mortar attack had failed because the shells had to travel upward at a relatively shallow angle to reach the German positions, making them easy to intercept or evade. But what if they didn't fire the mortar in the traditional forward direction? What if they turned the tube around, aimed it backward and upward at an extreme angle, and used the mortar's maximum range to arc the shell high into the air before it descended almost vertically onto the German positions? The room fell silent. Sergeant Walsh looked at Mitchell as if he had lost his mind. Lieutenant Pearson started to object, saying it violated every principle of mortar operation. But Captain Hensley held up his hand, his engineer's mind already working through the mathematics. He asked Mitchell to explain further. Mitchell grabbed a pencil and began sketching on the margin of the map. A standard 81mm mortar had a maximum range of approximately 3,000 yards when fired at a 45-degree angle. The German positions were roughly 800 yards away in a straight line. But if they positioned the mortar much closer to the German lines, turned it backward, and fired at a 70 to 80-degree angle, the shell would travel up and away from the Germans before gravity brought it down almost vertically onto their position. The extreme angle would make the shells nearly impossible to evade because they would be coming straight down, not from a predictable forward trajectory. Captain Hensley studied the rough diagram. He asked about accuracy. Mitchell admitted that would be the biggest challenge. They would need perfect calculations for the range, angle, and charge. One mistake and the shells could land on American positions or miss entirely. But Mitchell argued they had one critical advantage. The Germans weren't expecting an attack from that direction. Their defenses were oriented forward toward the American lines. They had sandbags, camouflage, and overhead protection designed to stop shells coming from the west. But their rear positions, the side facing away from the Americans, were likely less protected. A nearly vertical impact from an unexpected direction might penetrate their defenses. Sergeant Walsh was skeptical. He pointed out that mortars weren't designed to be fired backward. The tube was mounted on a base plate with a specific orientation. Turning it around would create massive recoil issues and could destroy the weapon or injure the crew. Mitchell acknowledged this, but suggested they could brace the mortar differently, dig it into the ground at an extreme angle, and use sandbags to absorb the backward recoil. It would be dangerous, and the mortar might only survive a few shots before the mounting failed, but they only needed to hit 3 targets. If they could put even 1 or 2 shells on each German cannon, the explosions might disable them, or at least kill enough crew members to render the guns inoperable. Lieutenant Pearson raised another concern. How would they get close enough to the German lines to set up this backward-firing mortar without being detected? The no-man's land between the two forces was roughly 400 yards of open, snow-covered ground with minimal cover. Any movement would be instantly visible. Mitchell had thought about this. He suggested they wait until evening, when the fading light and long shadows would provide some concealment. More importantly, for the past 3 days, the Germans had been firing their artillery at precisely 6:15 each evening, targeting American supply routes. During that bombardment, which lasted about 10 minutes, the German gun crews were focused on their own weapons, and forward observers were watching the impact zones to the west. That window might provide enough distraction for a small team to move forward and establish a firing position. Captain Hensley walked to the basement's small window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. He knew this plan was desperate and risky. If it failed, he would lose good men for nothing. But the conventional approaches had already failed, and time was running out. He made his decision. They would attempt Mitchell's plan that evening. He assigned Sergeant Walsh and 2 other experienced mortar men, Privates Eddie Torres and Leonard Burke, to accompany Mitchell. They would take 181mm mortar, 12 shells, and enough ammunition to defend themselves if things went wrong. Their objective was simple but brutal. Get into position, fire on the 3 German artillery pieces, destroy them, and get back to American lines alive. The afternoon passed in tense preparation. Mitchell worked with Walsh and the other men to modify their mortar. They removed the standard base plate and created a makeshift mounting using 3 wooden stakes driven into frozen ground at extreme angles, reinforced with sandbags. Walsh was a traditionalist who believed in doing things by the book, and watching Mitchell essentially rebuild a mortar to fire backward went against every instinct he had. But the Irishman was also a survivor who recognized desperate times called for desperate measures. He helped Mitchell calculate the precise angles needed, cross-checking the math multiple times to minimize errors. The mathematical calculations were complex and had to account for multiple variables. Mitchell sat in the corner of the farmhouse basement with a pencil, paper, and a slide rule he had carried since his university days. He calculated the muzzle velocity of the 81mm mortar rounds, approximately 700 feet per second. He factored in the weight of the shells, the air temperature which affected powder performance, the altitude difference between their firing position and the targets, and the wind speed which meteorological reports estimated at 8 to 12 miles per hour from the northwest. Each calculation had to be precise because they would only get 1 chance at this. There would be no opportunity for ranging shots or adjustments after the first round. They had to hit their targets immediately, or the Germans would locate their position and return fire with overwhelming force. Walsh watched Mitchell work through the mathematics with a mixture of admiration and skepticism. The sergeant had 15 years of military experience, but had never attended university. His knowledge of mortars came from thousands of hours of practical use, from firing tens of thousands of rounds in training and combat. He understood mortars instinctively, could estimate ranges by eye, and adjust fire based on observation. But what Mitchell was proposing went beyond Walsh's experiential knowledge. This required theoretical understanding of ballistics, physics, and mathematics that Walsh had never studied. The sergeant found himself in the uncomfortable position of trusting calculations on paper rather than his own hard-won combat experience. Private Torres helped gather intelligence for the mission. He spent the afternoon with the company's forward observers, studying the German positions through binoculars and spotting scopes. Torres sketched detailed drawings of the artillery emplacements, noting the positions of ammunition dumps, personnel shelters, and defensive positions. He counted the number of German soldiers visible around each gun, estimated their routine and timing, and identified potential obstacles that might interfere with mortar rounds. This information was critical for Mitchell's planning. Torres worked with quiet intensity, knowing that his observations might mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure. The forward observation post was a destroyed barn on the western edge of American lines, its roof collapsed and walls pockmarked with bullet holes. Torres lay in the frozen mud alongside Lieutenant Pearson and two other observers, watching the German positions through a gap in the rubble. The cold seeped through his uniform despite the layers of clothing. His fingers went numb holding the binoculars, but he forced himself to observe carefully, to notice details that might matter later. He saw that the German crews rotated every 2 hours, with fresh soldiers replacing those who had been manning the guns. He noticed that they stored ammunition in wooden crates covered with canvas tarps, positioned about 15 feet behind each howitzer. He observed that the rightmost gun had the largest crew, suggesting it might be the most important target. Lieutenant Pearson shared information from intelligence reports that had arrived that morning. German units in the sector were part of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, experienced troops who had fought on the Eastern Front before being transferred west. They were well-equipped and competent, not the demoralized conscripts that Allied forces sometimes encountered in late 1944. The artillery pieces themselves were 105mm F-18 howitzers, standard German divisional artillery with a range of over 10,000 meters. Each gun could fire 4 to 6 rounds per minute when fully crewed, making them formidable weapons that had already inflicted significant casualties on American forces. Back at the preparation area, Private Burke was conducting his own preparations, though of a different nature. While Mitchell calculated trajectories and Torres gathered intelligence, Burke cleaned and checked every weapon the team would carry. He disassembled his Browning automatic rifle completely, cleaning each component with methodical care, oiling the mechanisms, and reassembling it with practiced efficiency. Burke had learned in the Pennsylvania coal mines that tools required maintenance and respect. A broken tool underground could kill you. A malfunctioning weapon in combat absolutely would. He applied the same philosophy to the team's carbines, checking each magazine spring, testing each round for defects, ensuring that if they needed to fight their way back to American lines, their weapons would not fail them. Burke also prepared grenades, checking the fuses and pins on 6 fragmentation grenades they would carry. He packed extra ammunition in cloth bandoliers to minimize noise, wrapping each clip separately so metal wouldn't clink against metal during their approach. The big Pennsylvanian worked with calm efficiency, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he handled the weapons and explosives. Other soldiers in the company watched him work, seeing a different side of the man who was usually drunk and fighting. In preparation for combat, Burke displayed a professional competence that explained why officers tolerated his disciplinary problems. When lives were on the line, Burke was reliable in ways that transcended rank and regulation. Captain Hensley spent the afternoon coordinating with battalion headquarters and adjacent units. He arranged for diversionary artillery fire to begin at 6:30, 15 minutes after the German guns typically started their evening bombardment. The American artillery would target German positions to the north and south, drawing attention away from the sector where Mitchell's team would be operating. Hensley also positioned additional medics near the likely return route, ensuring that if the team came back wounded, medical assistance would be immediately available. He established signal procedures so the team could identify themselves when returning to friendly lines, preventing the nightmare scenario of being killed by their own troops in the darkness. The captain also wrote letters to the families of all 4 men going on the mission. This was not standard procedure, but Hensley believed in preparing for worst outcomes. If Mitchell, Walsh, Torres or Burke didn't return, their families would receive a personal letter from their commanding officer explaining that their loved one had volunteered for a dangerous mission of critical importance and had died serving honorably. Hensley sealed each letter and left them with the company clerk with instructions on when to mail them. Writing those letters forced him to confront the reality that he was sending men on a mission with low survival probability. But the alternative was continuing to lose men to German artillery, a slower death toll that would eventually destroy the company's effectiveness. As afternoon faded toward evening, the four-man team gathered for a final equipment check. Each man wore multiple layers of clothing under white snow capes, balancing warmth against mobility. They carried minimal personal equipment, leaving behind anything that might make noise or wasn't essential for the mission. Mitchell brought his calculation notes, waterproofed in a rubber pouch, along with a compass and watch. Walsh carried the mortar sight and aiming stakes. Torres had most of the mortar shells distributed in a specially designed pack that prevented them from striking each other. Burke carried his bar, extra ammunition and the grenades. They ate a hot meal in the company kitchen, probably the last hot food they would have for a while. The cooks had prepared beef stew with potatoes and carrots, simple fare that tasted extraordinary to men who knew they might not survive the night. They ate in silence, each lost in private thoughts. Mitchell thought about his family's farm in Iowa, wondering if he would ever see it again. Walsh thought about his wife in Boston and the daughter he had never met, born 3 months after he shipped overseas. Torres prayed silently, moving his lips in memorized words of comfort. Burke ate with mechanical efficiency, fueling his body for the work ahead, his mind already focused on the mission. At 5:30, Captain Hensley called them to the command post for final instructions. The captain's face was drawn with exhaustion and stress, but his voice was steady and confident. He reminded them of their objective, the timing, and the signal procedures for their return. He told them they were authorized to abort the mission at any point if circumstances made success impossible. Their lives were more valuable than any tactical objective. But Hensley also told them that he trusted their judgment, that if anyone could accomplish this impossible task, it was the 4 of them. He shook each man's hand again, holding eye contact with each in turn, communicating respect and confidence without words. Sergeant Walsh pulled Mitchell aside for a private conversation before they left. The older man spoke quietly, his Irish accent thickened by emotion. Walsh said that he had been skeptical of Mitchell's plan initially, that it seemed too clever and theoretical. But after working through the calculations and seeing Mitchell's thoroughness, Walsh believed the plan would work. More importantly, Walsh said that if something happened to him during the mission, Mitchell should take command and get the others back safely. Mitchell protested that Walsh was the senior NCO, but Walsh interrupted him. Rank mattered less than competence in moments like this. Mitchell had the knowledge and clarity of thought needed to lead. Walsh trusted him completely. The conversation revealed the depth of respect that had developed between the two men, despite their different backgrounds and approaches to soldiering. Walsh represented the old army, built on experience, tradition, and practical knowledge gained through years of service. Mitchell represented something newer, soldiers who brought technical education and analytical thinking to military problems. The war was creating situations where both approaches were necessary, where traditional military expertise needed to be supplemented by scientific and technical knowledge. Walsh and Mitchell's partnership embodied this synthesis, each man contributing strengths the other lacked. Private Torres was a quiet young man from Texas, barely 19 years old, who had joined the company as a replacement after the Normandy campaign. He was terrified, but tried not to show it. Torres had seen what German artillery could do, had helped pull wounded men from burning vehicles, after the guns they were about to attack had opened fire. The idea of getting closer to those weapons made his hands shake, but he trusted Mitchell's plan because he trusted Mitchell. The corporal had saved Torres's life 2 weeks earlier during a German counterattack, pulling him into a foxhole seconds before a shell exploded where Torres had been standing. Private Burke was different. He was a big man from Pennsylvania coal country, 31 years old, and the oldest private in the company. Burke had been demoted twice for fighting and drinking, but he was absolutely fearless in combat. He didn't care much about the technical aspects of Mitchell's plan. All Burke wanted to know was whether they would get a chance to kill Germans, and when Mitchell confirmed they would, Burke grinned and started checking his rifle. Burke carried a Browning automatic rifle, a powerful weapon that could provide covering fire if they were detected. As evening approached, the four men gathered their equipment. The mortar tube, base plate, and modified mounting weighed over 100 pounds total, divided between them. They carried 12 high-explosive shells, each one carefully wrapped to prevent noise. They wore white snow capes over their uniforms for camouflage and left behind everything non-essential, including helmets, which they replaced with white knit caps. Captain Hensley gave them final instructions in the farmhouse basement. Once they moved out, they would be on their own. The company couldn't provide covering fire without revealing the plan to the Germans. If things went wrong, they would have to fight their way back or die trying. At 5:45, with twilight settling over the Ardennes, the four-man team slipped out of American lines. The temperature had dropped to near zero, and fresh snow had started falling, which was both blessing and curse. The snow would help conceal their movement, but also made the ground treacherous and their tracks visible. Mitchell led the way, moving slowly and carefully, placing each step deliberately to minimize noise. Behind him came Walsh, then Torres, carrying most of the mortar shells, and finally Burke bringing up the rear with his bar ready. The no-man's land was eerily silent, except for the crunch of snow under their boots and the distant sound of German voices from the enemy positions. Mitchell could see the 3 artillery pieces through the falling snow, dark shapes against the white landscape, positioned in a rough triangle about 50 yards apart. Each gun had a crew of 6 to 8 men visible around it, loading shells and adjusting angles. The Germans seemed confident and relaxed, probably assuming the Americans had given up after yesterday's failed attack. They had no idea 4 enemy soldiers were crawling toward them through the snow. The team moved painfully slowly, taking nearly 40 minutes to cover 300 yards. Every few minutes they would freeze in place when German soldiers appeared on the perimeter, or when a flare went up from somewhere to the north. Mitchell's heart pounded so hard he was certain the Germans could hear it. His hands were numb despite his gloves, and sweat ran down his back despite the freezing temperature. This was nothing like the clean, simple problems he had solved in university classrooms. This was raw terror mixed with determination, every second stretched out into an eternity of waiting to be discovered and killed. At 6:10, the Germans began their evening bombardment. The 3 howitzers opened fire almost simultaneously, their muzzle flashes lighting up the darkening sky. The sound was deafening, a series of thunderous explosions that rolled across the valley. Mitchell used the noise as cover to move faster, leading his team the final 100 yards to a small rise about 300 yards behind the German positions. This was their firing position, a slight elevation that would give them the angle they needed while providing minimal cover behind a fallen tree and some rocks. They worked frantically to set up the mortar. Walsh and Burke drove the wooden stakes into the frozen ground, angling them backward at 75 degrees. Mitchell and Torres positioned the tube and secured it with rope and sandbags. The entire setup looked absurd, a mortar pointed away from the enemy, tilted back at an angle that seemed impossible. But Mitchell's calculations had been precise. He checked the angle with a makeshift protractor, adjusted it slightly, then nodded to Walsh. They were ready. The German bombardment continued, giving them a few more precious minutes of noise cover. Mitchell loaded the first shell, a high-explosive round that weighed 11 pounds. His hands were shaking, not from cold, but from adrenaline and fear. He had never done anything like this before. Everything depended on his math being correct, on angles and trajectories. He had calculated on paper, translating accurately to reality. If he was wrong, this shell would miss by hundreds of yards or land on American positions. Men would die because of his mistake. Walsh saw Mitchell's hesitation. The sergeant put a hand on the corporal's shoulder and said quietly that they trusted him, that his plan was their best chance. Mitchell took a deep breath, made a final adjustment to the elevation, and dropped the shell into the tube. The mortar fired with a deep thump, the recoil absorbed by the sandbags and improvised mounting. The shell arced up and back, disappearing into the darkening sky. 4 men held their breath, watching the German positions. 7 seconds later, an explosion erupted near the leftmost German howitzer. The shell had missed the gun itself, but landed close enough to kill 2 crew members and wound several others. Germans were shouting in confusion, trying to figure out where the attack had come from. They looked west toward American lines, exactly as Mitchell had predicted. They never thought to look behind them. Mitchell didn't waste time celebrating. He made a quick adjustment to the angle, loaded a second shell, and fired again. This time the shell landed directly on the leftmost howitzer, a perfect hit that detonated the ammunition stored nearby. The explosion was massive, a ball of fire that lit up the entire area. The German gun was destroyed completely, twisted metal and shattered wood scattered across the snow. German soldiers were running in all directions now, some trying to man their remaining guns, others seeking cover from an enemy they couldn't locate. The team worked with desperate efficiency. Torres handed shells to Mitchell, who loaded and fired as fast as the mortar would allow. Walsh adjusted angles between shots, targeting the center gun position. Burke kept watch to their rear, his bar ready in case German infantry came to investigate. The entire attack happened in controlled chaos, each man focused on his task while the world exploded around them. The third shell hit near the center howitzer, killing more crew, but missing the gun. The fourth shell was another direct hit, disabling the weapon's firing mechanism. Now 2 of the 3 German guns were out of action, but the rightmost howitzer was still operational. Its crew, realizing they were under attack from an unexpected direction, began turning their gun around to fire toward Mitchell's position. This was the moment of maximum danger. If that German gun fired even once, it would obliterate the American mortar team. Mitchell's hands moved with mechanical precision despite the fear coursing through him. 5th shell, loaded, fired. The round sailed through the air and impacted just short of the target. 6th shell, slight adjustment, fired. This one hit the sandbag wall protecting the German gun, creating a breach but not destroying the weapon. The German crew was almost ready to fire, loading their own shell with frantic speed. 7th shell. Mitchell barely aimed, relying on instinct and the pattern he had established with the previous shots. The round left the tube, and he immediately started loading the 8th shell, not even waiting to see the impact. The 7th shell hit the German howitzer's ammunition supply. The explosion was even larger than the first, a secondary detonation that destroyed not just the gun, but the entire position. Flames and debris shot hundreds of feet into the air. The concussion wave reached Mitchell's position, a blast of hot air that knocked Torres off his feet. The scene at the German artillery positions was complete chaos. Surviving crew members ran in confusion, some trying to fight fires, others searching for cover from an enemy they couldn't locate. German officers shouted orders that were barely heard over the roar of burning ammunition and the screams of wounded men. The 3 howitzers that had terrorized American forces for days were now twisted metal sculptures, completely destroyed. Smoke billowed into the darkening sky, visible for miles across the frozen landscape. Walsh immediately began timing their window for escape. He knew German infantry would be mobilizing to search the area, trying to locate the mysterious attackers. The team had perhaps 5 minutes, maybe 10 if they were lucky, before German soldiers would be swarming their position. Walsh called out instructions to the others, his voice cutting through the chaos with practiced authority. They needed to move now, needed to put distance between themselves and this location before the Germans organized an effective search. Torres struggled to his feet, ears ringing from the explosion. The young Texan's arm throbbed where a piece of shrapnel had grazed him, but adrenaline masked most of the pain. He helped Mitchell gather the remaining mortar shells they hadn't fired, though Walsh quickly told them to abandon everything except weapons. Speed was more important than equipment now. They had accomplished their mission. Survival was the only objective that mattered. Burke had already positioned himself to provide covering fire, his bar aimed toward the German positions. He could see enemy soldiers running toward their location, perhaps 50 or 60 men spreading out in a search pattern. Some Germans fired randomly into the darkness, hoping to hit the unseen attackers or at least suppress any further attack. Tracer rounds cut through the night, creating lines of light that crisscrossed the snow-covered ground. Burke waited patiently, his finger resting lightly on the trigger, ready to engage only if the Germans got too close. Mitchell took one last look at his improvised mortar setup, the backward-angled tube that had worked exactly as his calculations predicted. Part of him wanted to document this, to take measurements and notes that could be used to replicate the technique. But Walsh was right. They had to move immediately. Mitchell grabbed his rifle and followed Walsh toward the south, trusting the sergeant's combat experience to guide them safely back to American lines. The retreat was a nightmare of near misses and close calls. German machine guns opened fire sporadically, their crews shooting at sounds and shadows rather than confirmed targets. The 4 Americans moved through a small ravine that provided minimal cover, scrambling over frozen rocks and through patches of dense undergrowth. Mitchell slipped on ice-covered stones, nearly falling into a half-frozen stream. Walsh grabbed his arm, steadying him, then pushed him forward with urgent pressure. Torres was struggling more than the others, his wounded arm making it difficult to maintain balance on the treacherous terrain. Blood soaked through his uniform sleeve, despite the makeshift bandage he had tied around the wound. But the young private kept moving, driven by fear and determination in equal measure. He knew that stopping meant death or capture, and he had heard enough stories about German prisoner-of-war camps to prefer almost anything to capture. Burke maintained rear guard, periodically stopping to watch for pursuers and provide covering fire when necessary. The big Pennsylvanian moved with surprising agility for his size, using natural cover effectively and keeping his weapon ready. Twice, he fired short bursts from his bar when German soldiers got too close, forcing them to take cover and buying precious seconds for his teammates to extend their lead. Burke's military record might be marred by disciplinary problems, but in combat, he was absolutely professional. The darkness was simultaneously their greatest ally and most dangerous enemy. It concealed them from German shooters, but made navigation treacherous. Mitchell repeatedly checked his compass, trying to maintain their heading despite the difficult terrain. They were moving roughly southwest, angling away from the direct route back to American lines, but hopefully avoiding the heaviest German patrols. The plan was to circle around and approach friendly positions from an unexpected direction. After 20 minutes of desperate movement, they heard German voices very close, perhaps 30 yards behind them. An entire platoon seemed to be following their trail through the snow. Walsh made a quick decision, gesturing for the team to split temporarily. He and Burke would create a diversion by firing from one position while Mitchell and Torres continued toward American lines from another direction. It was risky, potentially separating the team permanently, but it might give Mitchell and Torres a chance to escape with the critical intelligence about the mission's success. Mitchell wanted to argue, wanted to keep the team together, but he understood the tactical logic. He nodded acceptance and led Torres toward the west, while Walsh and Burke positioned themselves behind a fallen tree. Mitchell and Torres moved as quietly as possible, every step carefully placed to minimize noise. Behind them, they heard Walsh and Burke open fire, the distinctive sound of Burke's bar echoing across the frozen landscape. German soldiers immediately returned fire, concentrating on Walsh and Burke's position. Mitchell pulled Torres into a depression in the ground, a natural foxhole created by an old tree stump. They lay motionless as German soldiers ran past their position, moving toward the gunfire to the south. The enemy passed within 10 feet of their hiding spot, close enough that Mitchell could hear their breathing and the jingle of equipment. He held his breath, pressing himself flat against the frozen earth, praying the Germans wouldn't look down and see them. The German patrol moved past without detecting them. Mitchell waited several minutes, listening to the sounds of combat continuing to the south. He worried about Walsh and Burke, hoped they would survive their diversionary action. But he also knew he had to keep moving, had to get Torres back to friendly lines and report the mission's success. That intelligence was crucial for the larger American offensive planned for the coming days. They continued westward, moving more cautiously now. The terrain gradually became more familiar as they approached areas Mitchell had patrolled during previous days. He recognized specific trees and terrain features, markers that told him they were getting close to American positions. But approaching friendly lines was perhaps the most dangerous part of the entire mission. Nervous American sentries might shoot at any movement in the darkness, especially with combat sounds echoing across the area. Mitchell and Torres approached an American outpost from the designated safe corridor that Captain Hensley had arranged. Mitchell called out the password, his voice hoarse from exertion and cold. There was a tense moment of silence before an American voice challenged them with the proper countersign. Mitchell responded correctly, and moments later they were being helped over the defensive line by soldiers from their own company. A medic immediately began treating Torres's arm wound, while other soldiers bombarded them with questions. Mitchell asked about Walsh and Burke, whether they had returned yet. The soldiers said no, they hadn't seen anyone else. Mitchell's heart sank, worried that his friends might have been captured or killed during the diversion. He reported to Captain Hensley, giving a quick summary of the mission's success and explaining that Walsh and Burke had split off to create a diversion. Hensley immediately organized a rescue party, volunteers who would move back into no man's land to search for the missing men. Mitchell insisted on going despite his exhaustion, arguing that he knew exactly where he had last seen them. The captain initially refused, but relented when Mitchell pointed out that only he could guide rescuers to the correct location. They assembled quickly, 10 men including Mitchell, carrying medical supplies and extra weapons in case Walsh and Burke were wounded and needed assistance fighting their way back. The rescue party moved cautiously into the darkness, following Mitchell's memory of the route. German activity had decreased somewhat, the enemy apparently pulling back to regroup after the devastating loss of their artillery. But patrols were still active, and the Americans moved with extreme caution. They reached the area where Mitchell had last seen Walsh and Burke approximately 30 minutes after leaving friendly lines. They found evidence of the firefight, spent brass casings glinting in the moonlight, and fresh scars on trees from bullet impacts. But no bodies, no signs of Walsh or Burke. Mitchell's relief was tempered by uncertainty about what had happened to them. Had they escaped in another direction, been captured? The rescue party searched the area carefully, looking for any clues. Then Burke's voice called out from a cluster of rocks 50 yards to the south, using the password. The rescue party rushed toward the sound, weapons ready in case it was a German trap. But it was indeed Burke, crouched behind the rocks with Walsh lying beside him. The sergeant had been hit during the firefight, a bullet through his left leg that had shattered his femur. Burke had carried him to this position and defended it against several German probes while trying to stop Walsh's bleeding. Walsh was conscious, but in severe pain, his face pale from blood loss despite Burke's first aid efforts. The medic with the rescue party immediately began more sophisticated treatment, administering morphine and applying proper pressure dressages. They fashioned a stretcher from tree branches and cloth, carefully loading Walsh onto it for transport back to American lines. Burke, despite his own exhaustion, insisted on helping carry the stretcher. The return journey took over an hour, the group moving slowly to avoid jarring Walsh's injury. German patrols were still active, and twice the group had to freeze in place while enemy soldiers passed nearby, but they made it back to American lines without further incident. Walsh was immediately evacuated to a field hospital, where surgeons worked through the night to save his leg. The injury would eventually end his combat service, but he would survive and return home to Boston and the family he had fought so hard to protect. For a moment, everything was silent, except for the ringing in their ears. Then, German machine guns opened fire, tracers cutting through the darkness. The Germans didn't know exactly where the American mortar team was, but they were firing in all directions, trying to suppress the mysterious attackers. Burke returned fire with his bar, short, controlled bursts that forced the Germans to take cover. Walsh was already breaking down the mortar, preparing for their retreat. Mitchell took one last look at the German positions through the smoke and flames. All 3 artillery pieces were destroyed or disabled, twisted metal silhouettes against the fire. The mission was complete, accomplished in roughly 90 seconds of actual firing. But they still had to get back alive, and now every German in the area knew approximately where they were. The retreat was pure survival. They couldn't carry the mortar equipment, so they abandoned everything except weapons and ammunition. Mitchell led them south, away from the direct route back to American lines, moving through a small ravine that provided some cover from German fire. Bullets snapped through the air around them, kicking up snow and splintering trees. Torres was hit in the arm, a grazing wound that bled heavily but wasn't life-threatening. Burke stopped twice to lay down suppressing fire, buying seconds for the others to move. They ran through the darkness, stumbling over frozen ground and fallen logs. German voices shouted behind them, soldiers pursuing, but confused about their exact position. The falling snow helped conceal their tracks, and the chaos they had created gave them a small head start. Mitchell's lungs burned from the cold air and exertion. His legs felt like lead weights, but he kept moving, knowing that stopping meant death or capture. After 20 minutes of desperate flight, they encountered an American patrol near the original defensive line. The password exchange was hasty and breathless, but once identity was confirmed, the patrol provided covering fire, while Mitchell's team collapsed behind friendly lines. They had made it back. All 4 men were alive, though Torres needed medical attention for his arm, and all of them were suffering from exhaustion and early stages of frostbite. Captain Hensley met them at the command post. The officer's stern demeanor had cracked slightly, relief evident in his eyes. He had watched the explosions from his position and knew the mission had succeeded, but he hadn't been certain the team would return alive. He shook each man's hand personally, a gesture of respect that crossed normal military boundaries between officers and enlisted men. Hensley told them that forward observers had confirmed all 3 German howitzers were destroyed. The valley was now clear for American movement. The next morning, with the German artillery threat eliminated, American forces advanced through the valley with minimal resistance. The German infantry, having lost their artillery support and seen the devastating accuracy of the American attack, withdrew during the night. The 28th Infantry Division's path north was clear, and they linked up with other units as planned. The offensive succeeded, in part because of what 4 men had accomplished in 90 seconds with a backward-firing mortar. Mitchell and his team were awarded Bronze Stars for valor, presented at a brief ceremony 3 weeks later in a muddy field in Luxembourg. The medals felt heavy in Mitchell's hand, discs of bronze that somehow represented those terrifying minutes behind enemy lines. But more important than the medals was what the mission proved. Sometimes, the most effective solutions came from thinking differently, from questioning assumptions and finding creative answers to impossible problems. Sergeant Walsh remained skeptical of unconventional tactics, but he developed a grudging respect for Mitchell's engineering approach to combat. The 2 men became close friends, their different perspectives complementing each other through the remaining months of the war. Walsh taught Mitchell the practical combat skills that kept soldiers alive in close quarters fighting. Mitchell showed Walsh how understanding physics and mathematics could provide tactical advantages in artillery and demolitions work. Together, they survived the Battle of the Bulge, the Rhine crossing, and the final push into Germany. Private Torres recovered fully from his wound and returned to duty within 2 weeks. The young Texan gained confidence from the mission, realizing he was capable of more courage than he had believed. He wrote letters home describing the attack, though censors removed most details. His family in San Antonio saved those letters, and decades later Torres's grandson would donate them to a military history museum where researchers would use them to reconstruct the events of that December evening in the Ardennes. Private Burke continued his pattern of being simultaneously the company's best fighter and worst disciplinarian. He was demoted to private twice more before the war ended, both times for fighting with military police during leave. But in combat, Burke was fearless and reliable, the kind of soldier commanders wanted on their side when things got desperate. He survived the war, returned to Pennsylvania, and rarely spoke about his service. The backward mortar attack was one of the few stories he would tell, usually late at night after a few drinks, when friends asked about his time in Europe. Captain Hensley wrote a detailed after-action report about the mission, including Mitchell's technical calculations and the tactical situation that made such an unconventional approach necessary. That report circulated through Army artillery schools after the war, becoming a case study in creative problem-solving under pressure. Military instructors used it to teach that doctrine and standard procedures were important, but sometimes circumstances required thinking beyond established methods. Several artillery innovations in the post-war years traced their intellectual lineage back to Mitchell's backward-firing mortar, though few people knew the connection. The war ended 5 months later, in May 1945. Mitchell returned to Iowa and finished his engineering degree on the GI Bill. He worked as a civil engineer for 40 years, designing bridges and buildings across the Midwest. He married, raised 3 children, and lived a quiet life far from the violence of his youth. But he never forgot that evening in the Ardennes, the weight of the mortar shells, the sound of explosions, the feeling of absolute terror mixed with determination. Those 90 seconds defined something fundamental about who he was, a test he had passed not because he was fearless, but because he refused to give up when others saw no solution. In 1988, at a 28th Infantry Division reunion in Philadelphia, Mitchell met the son of a German artillery officer who had been at the Ardennes position that December evening. The German officer had survived the attack, wounded but alive, and had told his family about the mysterious bombardment that came from behind his lines, seemingly out of nowhere. The son wanted to meet the American soldiers who had carried out that attack. It was an awkward encounter at first, decades-old enemies sitting across a table in a hotel conference room. But they talked for hours, sharing perspectives from opposite sides of the same battle. The German officer's son explained that his father had believed the Americans must have had artillery pieces they didn't know about, hidden somewhere to the east. He never imagined a small mortar team had infiltrated that close and fired backward. When Mitchell explained the actual technique, the German officer's son laughed, a sound of disbelief and admiration. He said his father would have appreciated the ingenuity, that German military tradition valued innovative tactics and unconventional thinking. War was terrible, both men agreed, but within that horror were occasional moments of human brilliance and courage that transcended nationality. Mitchell died in 2003 at age 83, surrounded by family in a small town in Iowa. His obituary mentioned his Bronze Star, but didn't detail the mission that earned it. Few people in town knew the full story of what he had accomplished during the war, but his grandchildren found his service records and medals after his death, and they began researching his military history. They discovered the after-action reports, the citations, the technical drawings Mitchell had kept in a box in his basement. They learned that their quiet grandfather, who had built bridges and coached Little League baseball, had once done something extraordinary under impossible circumstances. The backward mortar attack near Wiltz became a minor footnote in the vast history of World War II, a small tactical success in a campaign filled with thousands of battles. Military historians occasionally reference it in discussions of artillery tactics or unconventional warfare. But for the men who were there, for the soldiers who watched those German guns explode and realized they might survive another day, it was much more than a footnote. It was proof that creativity and courage could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. It was evidence that one person with an idea, supported by teammates willing to take risks, could change the course of events. The three destroyed howitzers remained where they fell for several weeks after the battle, twisted monuments to that 90-second engagement. Eventually, they were cleared by salvage crews, the metal recycled into new weapons or infrastructure. The snow that had covered the battlefield that December melted in spring, revealing the scars of combat underneath. Within a year, grass began growing over the artillery positions. Within a decade, young trees sprouted in the shell craters. Nature slowly erased the evidence of what had happened there, but the memory persisted in the minds of those who had experienced it. Sergeant Walsh told the story to his sons, emphasizing the importance of trusting capable people even when their ideas seemed crazy. Private Torres spoke about it at veterans events, describing how teamwork and preparation could overcome fear. Captain Hensley included it in lectures at the Army War College, using it to illustrate the difference between following doctrine blindly and understanding when circumstances demanded innovation. And Mitchell carried it quietly, a private knowledge that when the moment demanded it, he had been capable of more than he imagined. The lesson of that December evening in the Ardennes extended beyond military tactics. It spoke to fundamental truths about human capability and problem-solving. When conventional approaches fail, creativity becomes essential. When the stakes are highest, unconventional thinking can mean the difference between success and failure. When others see only obstacles, some people see opportunities. And sometimes, the most effective solution is the one nobody expects, the approach that violates standard procedures, but works precisely because it's unexpected. Mitchell's backward mortar attack saved lives by preventing further German artillery bombardments. It cleared a path for American forces to advance, contributing to the eventual Allied victory, but perhaps more importantly, it demonstrated that even in the rigid structure of military organization, there was room for innovation and creative thought. It showed that expertise mattered, that Mitchell's engineering education, though incomplete, gave him perspective others lacked. It proved that rank and experience weren't the only measures of value, that sometimes a corporal had better ideas than captains. The 4 men who carried out that mission were ordinary soldiers in many ways. They weren't elite special forces or highly trained specialists. They were regular infantrymen who volunteered for a dangerous assignment because their unit needed a solution to an urgent problem. They were scared, cold, and exhausted like everyone else in the winter of 1944. But when asked to do something extraordinary, they found reserves of courage and competence they might not have known they possessed. That's the real story of the backward mortar attack, not just the technical achievement, but the human achievement of overcoming fear to accomplish something difficult and important. In the decades after the war, military technology advanced far beyond the simple mortars and howitzers of 1944. Precision-guided munitions, satellite targeting, and drone warfare changed the nature of artillery combat. But the fundamental principle Mitchell demonstrated remained relevant. Understanding the physics and mathematics of projectile motion, thinking creatively about firing solutions, and being willing to try unconventional approaches when circumstances demanded it, these insights continued to matter regardless of technological advancement. Veterans of the European theatre sometimes spoke about the randomness of survival, how luck played such a large role in who lived and who died. But Mitchell's story suggested that survival wasn't entirely random. Skill, intelligence, and innovative thinking could tilt the odds. Yes, luck mattered. Bullets and shells didn't discriminate. But being able to analyze a situation, identify a solution, and execute it effectively increased the chances of survival for yourself and those depending on you. Mitchell's engineering education, Walsh's experience, Torres's reliability, and Burke's courage weren't lucky accidents. They were capabilities these men brought to a critical moment, and those capabilities made the difference. The story of 3 enemy cannons destroyed in 90 seconds by a mortar aimed backward became part of the collective memory of the 28th Infantry Division. New soldiers joining the unit after the war heard about it during training. It became an example used to illustrate problem-solving under pressure, thinking outside standard doctrine, and trusting the expertise of subordinates. The 28th Division had a long history stretching back to the American Revolution, filled with battles and heroic actions. The backward mortar attack was just one small addition to that history, but it represented something important about the division's character and the soldiers who served in it. For Mitchell personally, the mission marked a turning point in his military service. Before that evening, he had been just another replacement soldier, trying to survive each day without thinking much beyond immediate threats. After the mission, he understood his own capabilities better. He knew he could function under extreme pressure, that his education had practical value in combat situations, and that he was capable of leadership even if he wore corporal stripes instead of officer bars. That self-knowledge stayed with him throughout the war and beyond, shaping how he approached challenges in civilian life. The Ardennes forest where the attack took place is peaceful now, popular with hikers and nature enthusiasts. Small memorials mark various battle sites from the winter of 1944, remembering the soldiers who fought and died there. Few visitors to the area know about the specific location where Mitchell's mortar teams set up their backward-firing position. No plaque or monument marks that spot, but the forest remembers in its own way, in the trees that grew from soil enriched by the decomposition of war materials, in the peace that exists because young men were willing to take terrible risks to end a terrible conflict. Mitchell sometimes returned to Europe in his later years, visiting battlefields and memorials with other veterans. He walked through the Ardennes in 1989, trying to find the exact location where he had fired those 12 mortar rounds. The landscape had changed significantly in 45 years. Roads were different, trees had grown, and buildings had been constructed or destroyed. He couldn't identify the precise spot with certainty, but standing in that forest, feeling the same cold wind that had blown that December evening, Mitchell remembered everything with perfect clarity. The fear, the determination, the sound of shells exploding, the desperate retreat through darkness. Those memories were as sharp as if the events had happened yesterday. He thought about the German soldiers who had died in the attack. They had been enemies, certainly, fighting for a cause Mitchell believed was fundamentally wrong. But they had also been young men far from home, following orders and trying to survive, much like Mitchell himself. Their deaths weren't something he celebrated, even decades later. They were tragic necessities of a war Mitchell hadn't started and couldn't have prevented. He honored their memory by acknowledging their humanity, even while recognizing that their guns had to be destroyed to save American lives. War was full of such moral complexities, actions that were simultaneously necessary and regrettable. The technique Mitchell pioneered, firing mortars at extreme backward angles for nearly vertical impact, was never formally adopted as standard doctrine. It was too situational, too dependent on specific circumstances to become regular practice. But the thinking behind it influenced artillery tactics in subtle ways. The idea that firing solutions didn't have to be conventional, that unusual approaches might work when standard methods failed, became part of how artillery officers thought about problems. Mitchell's contribution wasn't a specific technique so much as a mindset, an approach to problem-solving that valued creativity alongside doctrine. In the final analysis, the story of the backward-firing mortar attack represents something larger than a single tactical success in World War II. It illustrates how ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. It shows the value of education and expertise, even in situations where they seem irrelevant. It demonstrates that innovation often comes from unexpected sources, from corporals as well as captains, and it reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear, to do what needs doing even when success isn't guaranteed. Mitchell lived long enough to see his grandchildren grow up, to retire from a successful career, to enjoy decades of peace he had helped secure. He never considered himself a hero, always deflecting praise by mentioning the teammates who supported him and the circumstances that made success possible. But to the soldiers who benefited from his actions that December evening, to the men who advanced through a valley no longer threatened by German artillery, he was exactly that. A hero who saw a problem everyone else thought was unsolvable, who trusted his own knowledge and abilities enough to propose a crazy-sounding solution, and who had the courage to attempt it when others' lives depended on success. The backward mortar attack lasted 90 seconds. The preparation took hours. The impact lasted decades. That's often how significant moments work, brief actions with long-lasting consequences, decisions made under pressure that ripple forward through time. Mitchell couldn't have known, as he loaded those shells in freezing darkness, that he was creating a story that would be told and retold for generations. He was simply trying to accomplish a mission, to do his job as well as possible under impossible circumstances. That he succeeded and survived to tell about it was a combination of skill, courage, support from teammates, and yes, some measure of luck. But primarily, it was the result of one man willing to think differently and act decisively when the moment demanded it. That willingness to think differently, to question assumptions and find creative solutions, remains relevant today regardless of the specific challenges we face. The technologies and circumstances change, but the fundamental human capacities for innovation and courage persist. Mitchell's story reminds us that when confronted with seemingly insurmountable obstacles, the answer might lie not in doing more of what hasn't worked, but in trying something entirely different. Sometimes you have to aim backward to move forward. Sometimes the most effective solution is the one nobody expects, and sometimes the best weapons against impossible odds are creativity, determination, and the willingness to try.